I'm so excited to be with you all. Welcome to a new way to talk about sex with older adults. I'm so happy that that's my work. And I came to this work later in life, and I just became a sexuality educator when I got my PhD 5 years ago. And my mission is to promote the sexual well-being of older adults, particularly marginalized older adults, and those who are living in senior living communities. And as Melissa said, I'm a educator, I'm a writer, I'm a researcher, and I'm a blogger. And I blog for ageright.org and Hot Octopus, whom you might know. They're wonderful. And I work at the intersection of age, sex, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, and class. And I've got more than 30 years experience as a trainer. So as a sexuality educator, I get to speak all over the country. I'm actually right now in Western Massachusetts, where, by the way, it's kind of hot. I don't know if it's as hot as it is in Southern California, but I talk about sexuality issues as they relate to older adults. And as Melissa said, I just finished my first book, and I have an article published about older adult sexuality in LGBTQ communities in the Journal of Homosexuality, and I'll be happy to give you those citations at the end. But instead of avoiding the topic or feeling completely awkward when you're talking to older adults, I want to offer you some really helpful tips about sexuality so that you can do better in your clinical practice and you can do better work really as you're talking to older adults in the rest of your lives. So just quickly, I have no disclosures to report. And I wanted to tell you that I developed this workshop because I wanted to play with some ideas I've been working on around older adult sexuality and the science of older adult sexuality. I wanted to talk to you about how sexuality for older adults is experienced. And I wanted to talk about it because there's a lot of us who have difficulties talking about sex with people who are older than us or with older adults, and especially those in our clinical practice. I've got some learning objectives here that you can take note of. And perhaps you came with some questions, right? Maybe you've been wrestling with something. Maybe some folks in your practice have come up with questions that you weren't quite sure how to answer, or you wanted some topics you wanted more help on. Please put them right in the chat. And I see people already doing that, and that's fantastic. I'm happy to answer any of those questions, and Melissa's going to help me with that as well, as she said. Now, Melissa said that I did this TED Talk. And by the way, TED Talks are really important and really hard, but they're really great to have done. It's like writing, right? Writing is really hard, but it's great to have done it. And so I'm just going to read you one quick quote from my TED Talk. Why are we so afraid to even consider that there may be a new way to think about their and our own sexual journeys? If we allow ourselves to see our elders as fully human, ultimately, we'll be making room for ourselves and our own futures as sexual beings. Though it's true that people move more slowly when they're old and are often in need of assistance and they rarely generate income, they just may have some keys to happiness. And it's quite possible that one of them is about love, intimacy, and sex. You know the old saying that youth is wasted on the young? Among the benefits to being old are precisely the ingredients that make someone ready for a deep and intimate sexual life. Older age frequently comes with an openness, authenticity, and a deep appreciation for connection. So what will it take to see people as fully human, no matter what state their body or mind is in? And if you're interested, go to my website. You can get a link to the TED Talk, or you can just go on the TED or YouTube channels. Because I wanted to gear this talk to a wide variety of clinical folks, administrative folks, and older adults yourselves, I want to make sure that we were really clear on some of these terms, particularly because I found that those of us in the sexuality world aren't always as well versed as gerontologists are about older adults' world. And those of us in the gerontology world aren't as well versed as those of us in the sexuality world. So I just want to start with ageism because it's one of the most insidious of all the dimensions of discrimination and oppression. that if we're fortunate enough to get old, it's one that we will all face, no matter what our race or religion or identity or sexual identity or gender identity or any other way we get carved up in this world. And although ageism refers to the ways we treat actually not only older people, but younger people, both ends of the lifespan, and while it entails many different aspects of our lives, it's by far one of the most poorly understood social constructs that permeate our society. Let me give you some, for instance. Simone de Beauvoir, whom I loved, in Coming of Age back in 1970, wrote that the French policy of institutionalizing the elderly poor, she wrote, quote, may be summed up in a few words: abandonment, segregation, decay, dementia, death. Now, Kathleen Woodward, who's a pioneer in advocating for the rights of older adults, in her book Aging and Its Discontents, Freud and Other Fictions, in 1991, said that she used a psychoanalytic perspective on aging. And she said, old age in Freudian terms is castration. We'll speak to a lot of these ideas in a moment, but briefly, ageism is the idea that old people are supposed to be frail, incompetent, less than, laughable. Think of all the old people jokes we've heard that are still allowed. A forgotten name can easily be written off as a senior moment. The act of buying a birthday card for anyone over 30 takes on all these new dimensions in humor that's derogatory and really prejudiced. And why is it that a card suggesting a 40-year-old has an active sexual life is considered humorous? Even a basic interaction with an older adult when the person's age is revealed can trigger what seems like an innocuous response. Really? You don't look 78. As though like there's one way that you're supposed to look when you're 78 that maybe is a compliment not to appear so. And what does a 78-year-old look like? Is it any better or worse than looking 5 or 35? These compliments actually equate health with youth, and they resonate with the coded messages in media that say that it's important to be young, to be vital, to be alive, to be whatever, just not old. Now, when we talk about the terms sex and sexuality, those of us who are sexuality professionals know that along with sexual intercourse or penetration, which is just one way to have sex, but we'll get to that in a moment, sex is also the label assigned at birth based on your reproductive organs. Gender identity is not only an issue for young people, and sexuality, as Pat Schiller, who was the founder of Asex, noted, is a whole set of intersecting areas that include intimacy, relationships, orientation, identity, response, attraction, reproductive health, sexual health, conception and contraception, sexual exploitation, and all the values that are placed on each of these. Sexual changes with aging, and I'll discuss these more in depth in a moment, are the biopsychosocial changes that continue throughout the lifespan and can affect desire, attraction, sexual expression, and interpersonal relationships. The sexual wellness model that just was produced by Mitchell and their colleagues show 4 intersecting circles of sexual health, pleasure, well-being, and justice. And it really is a wonderful accompaniment to Dennis Daly's Circles of Sexuality model that he developed back in '81 that some of you may know about. PIV and other sexual expressions, or penis and vagina intercourse, is hardly the only way to have sex. And other sexual expressions may include anal, oral, solo, frottage, serious makeout sex, online or phone sex, sex toys, nipple and breast play, tickle play, tantra, just to name a few. And all of these are behaviors that also exist for older adults. Excuse me a moment. When I talk about outer course, excuse me, outer course is yet another sexual expression. And it's a term that many of us are using to define any type of sexual expression that does not include penetration. Alternative sexual identities in the kink or BDSM communities also exist in older adults populations and fall under the large tenter of kink or BDSM. And being a kink aware clinician means that you don't just stop with younger people, but you talk to older adults as well in terms of being kink aware. Inappropriate sexual behaviors, or ISBs, or any type of sexual attention that's not consensual. And in older adults, you see this very often with older adults who may not have understood or learned about consent, as many of us have with younger adults, but it's also paired with, unfortunately, some cognitive impairments. And we can talk about that later if you're interested. I have a whole course on that, on consent and dementia and older adults. IPV, or what we used to call domestic violence, or what happened to battered women. Now we use non-gendered terms like intimate partner violence, can occur within older adult populations as well as the young. And what I'd like you to do is investigate your own awareness and comfort with sexuality issues as they might relate to your older clients or patients or even students. And some of the questions I might ask relate to your knowledge of sexually active older adults, your knowledge of specific sexual behaviors with older adults, and your knowledge of specific sexual challenges with older adults. You see, communicating about sex with older adults or their families or friends means that their clinical concerns can get addressed much more readily. Today, I wanted to take you on a very short 5-minute journey into the hearts and minds of older adults. It's a sweet film that was made by a film student, actually, in Southern California at USC in 2004. And although it's not the most diverse group of individuals, either because of their geography or their politics or their religions, there aren't too many videos out there that are really the true words and lived experiences of older adults. So I'm using it with that caveat. And I'd like you to listen to and watch the video with two parts of your mind open, right? One is to just take in their words and their experiences, and the other is to think about who you might meet who might have some similar experiences that you may come into contact with professionally. So Melissa, let's cross our fingers and see if this works. And I think it will. It starts off very quietly, so don't turn your speakers up too quickly, and then see how it goes after about the first 10 seconds.
Do you want? The most romantic thing is the moment when I ask her, do you want to go to bed with me?
The first time I said no.
So a few days later, I asked her again, and she agreed. This was the most romantic, wasn't it? The most romantic thing. My name is David Bielobroda.
My name is Ruth Cooper, and my age is 79.
I was born in 1980.
My age is 92.
My name is Sunga Greisman Rubin, and I'm 84, going on 85.
How old am I?
Well, I truly believe you stay young because of sex.
At 18, we just wanted a sex object. At 75, you may still want sex. You're not sure you're going to get it, but you're looking for comfort.
I've always wanted romance in my life. Really love, and I think you need it all your life. You need it all your life. You need to be touched. You need to be felt. You need to be hugged. You need to be kissed.
Companionship is very important.
So we cover it up with, well, I don't need men in my life, and I'm past my desires. Baloney. I don't think you ever get past your sexual desires.
I adore it, and I'm not ashamed of it.
Yeah, he doesn't look it. He's a very sensual man.
Very.
Listen, I've had so many boyfriends, I can't even count them on my fingers and toes.
Most of the men my age or better are either dead, looking for a nurse or a purse, or sick.
I'm short, reserved, self-conscious, eager to please. I'm compassionate, a good listener.
I used to always look for a good-looking man and good dancers. That's what counted. And dress well. Oh, God forbid they shouldn't dress
She
well.
would be a non-smoker.
Yes, pretty, beautiful also,
He has to have his shit together.
Kindness, consideration.
sparkle in their eyes.
That tips well.
And no Republicans, please.
But there is something about a senior citizen community that you realize that you are mortal, you know? You see too many people around you, and you know that someday you're going to say bye-bye too.
Unfortunately, I've outlived just about every one of my friends.
You know, at this age, there isn't much time for independence. You know, you think there's just a few years left, and you want to do as much as possible togetherness.
When my husband died, he was 52. I took off my wedding ring and I said to myself, I wonder what's around the corner for me. And I think instead of sitting and saying, oh, he died, I always looked forward.
The person in my age who has the capacity of doing sex, this is the highest thing in the world, the greatest achievement in the world. And the pleasure is unbelievable.
This business of saying a man uses a woman for a one-nighter, what about a woman using a man? Is that terrible? Kushmir and Tochasarai. You know what that means? I hate to tell you. Kiss my you-know-what. It is, when you say it in English, it sounds bad, right? But in Jewish, it's kind of cute. And someone says something to you, you say, yeah, Kushmir and Tochasarai, kind of cute, you know.
I had to leave it to the end so you could see that she dedicated it to her grandpa. Wasn't that sweet? When one of the men was talking about it, we don't have enough years left for independence. It reminded me of Maggie Kuhn. I don't know if you know her. She was the founder of the Grey Panthers, a pretty amazing activist, who said there's too much focus on independence. We need to focus on interdependence. So I'd like to continue by getting us started into the heart of our discussion today around current research on sexuality and aging. I'd like to begin with the Harvard study of adult development. This is probably something that's a little bit outside of our world of sexology, but it's the longest running longitudinal study of adult development, 75 years actually. And amid all the data that they have amassed, they found that relationships are the key to happiness. That people are, look at money and wealth and status, but in fact, relationships are the key. And that people who are most satisfied in relationships at age 50 were happiest at age 80. Interesting for us to think about, particularly, I mentioned Woodward. She talks about midlife fears about getting older, and it's helpful to remember that 50-80 rule. Also, most research focused on older adults. focuses only on medical problems and belie the realities of sexual pleasure for older adults. So what I wanted to do was give you a bit of information about some of the science that's been coming out recently about older adults. And even though there is some research, there's really very little that focuses on older adult populations. But let's begin with John Delamater and Mormon's article in 2007. They found that most adults remain sexually active into their 60s and 70s. And I have to say, anecdotally, I've heard many reports of people in their 80s and 90s. But they looked at age-related physical changes like hormonal levels, medications, chronic illnesses, and they found that those do not necessarily lead to a decline in sexual functioning. The key factors associated with continued sexual activity are three things: good physical and mental health, positive attitudes towards sex, and access to a healthy partner or partners. Maggie Syme and her colleagues just a couple of years ago did a very interesting study of people ages 45 to 75, about looking at people in midlife and older adults. And they tried to find out why people are engaging or disengaging from sex. And what they found was that people are keenly aware of physical and psychological limitations and strengths, but that people mostly emphasized mutual experiences and synchronicity, and that people reflected on age, drawing comparisons to different phases of their lives, often displaying adaptability and adjusting their expectations as they aged. And one of the things that I loved about their article, by the way, the title, "At My Age, ... is this refrain that I hear very often from particularly women in my age. I'm in my late 60s and older, who say, at my age, not so important to be sexual. But what she found was, that was so interesting, that when conceptualizing this idea of sexual wellness in this population, it's imperative to capture the multidimensionality of people's lives as they age and include those who are not only actively engaging in sex, but being aware of the influence of ageist and dysfunction narratives, right? This idea that we're involved in this decline and this loss, which we'll talk about later as well. Lee and colleagues found that more than half of all men and about a third of all women between the ages of 50 and 90 reported having sex at least twice a month. Now, I'm not a big fan of frequency, as many of you are probably not either. Frequency may not be the equivalent of pleasure, but we're seeing regular sexual expression in that population. And Beverly Whipple, whom I love and revere, and is one of my mentors, with her colleagues in Quad S, did an amazing meta-analysis of the health benefits of regular sexual expression. And remember, that can be a complicated term, but she found that it can prevent heart disease, and the complications of heart disease can reduce the risks of breast cancer and prostate cancer, and that sexual stimulation can alleviate chronic pain, and that stimulation resulting in orgasm produces the greatest increase in pain relief, because sexual arousal and orgasm increase levels of endorphins and other hormones like oxytocin or other neurotransmitters that can actually ease the discomforts of pain disorders. And finally, that it can improve your overall quality of life. Other health benefits, Justin Lehmiller, in his more recent book about sexual fantasies, looked at much of the science for sexual pleasure and found that as we age, orgasms can provide a temporary boost to the immune system, as well as this pain relief that Beverly Whipple and her colleagues found, and that frequent sexual activity has been linked to better memory. That's really good to remember for all of us. And that there's a potential to increase self-awareness. So why is it that older adults have sex, right? I mean, we're not having sex because we want to create children. Many people are talking about this idea of love, commitment, and companionship. Gewertz, Maiden, and Ailon did a beautiful study, and they found that it can increase the ability to maintain overall functioning, to feel young again, to feel attractive and desirable. That older adults talk about going from lust when they were young to love as they get older, and this idea from getting sex to giving sex as they get older. The folks at the University of Michigan teamed up with the ARP a few years ago and found that about 75% said that sex matters to their quality of life, and that about 73% reported sexual satisfaction. Now, feelings of sexual competence tend to increase with age. But what about people who are not in heterosexual relationships? Because all of the studies that I've just reported to you were developed around populations that were primarily heterosexual couples. And what about SOGI, or sexual orientation or gender identity populations of elders? Well, what I found with my colleagues, Pat Koch and Betsy Crane, in the Journal of Homosexuality in 2019, was that looking at older adults ages 60 to 75 in same-sex relationships, regardless of their gender, satisfaction was about the same, and that there are correlations to low internalized homophobia, which I did not expect, high resilience, and a high relationship satisfaction. And that each of those were correlated, and that relationship satisfaction was a predictor of sexual satisfaction. Furlow and colleagues, in a wonderful article that's called "Could We Hold Hands?" talking about older adults moving into senior living communities, found that discrimination, preserving their LGBTQ identity, the expenditure of energy that they had to put forward to get people to recognize who they were, and the nuanced care and distrust of healthcare providers were major issues for that age group as well. I'd like to begin our discussion of sexual challenges by looking at Lindau and their colleagues, who talked about low desire, difficulties with lubrication vaginally, and an inability to climax. And most importantly, to many of the people with penises in the population, difficulties with erections. I offered the definitions before of inappropriate sexual behaviors and intimate partner violence. And I wanted to say that although the greatest fear and concern by administrators and clinicians who call me and email and text me is that they're worried that people with cognitive decline are exhibiting some form of inappropriate sexual behavior or are getting victimized by it. And yet the studies have shown that only 7% of people with dementia exhibit inappropriate sexual behavior, yet it's really often the main concern. And for people living at home over the age of 62, at least 1.4 million with suspected or diagnosed dementia are sexually active. And more than 10% of older adults living with a partner report feeling threatened or frightened by a partner. And these numbers remind us that intimate partner violence can occur at any age. There are some special concerns I wanted to bring to your attention. We're now in the third or maybe fourth iteration of our pandemic with the Delta variant, and that COVID-19 realities have shown disproportionate health outcomes. That we know that over 90% of the people who have died from COVID-19 are over the age of 50, and many of those are people of color and people who have lower socioeconomic status. People who are poor have much less access to adequate health care. We know that we're in the middle of a conversation in our country right now around racial identity and also racial justice. And we know for people who are from backgrounds where their racial or ethnic background or their cultural community have often felt defeated by our healthcare system, we see that there are special concerns about sexuality as well. And we know that people with alternative sexual identities, as I said earlier, exist at any age group and can feel extremely concerned when particularly they move into a new senior living community and don't feel as comfortable to be their authentic selves as they used to. We talked about gender and sexual minorities science, but for concerns of this nature for lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, trans men, trans women, people who consider themselves non-binary, just to think about any of these folks on the LGBTQ queer continuum, that growing older can mean for many of them coming out another time after they have felt so comfortable in their skin in earlier parts of their lives. Thanks to Shalama Firestone, the Dialectics of Sex. I wanted to talk about the dialectics of sex and aging, and also to my colleague Stephen Duclos at the South Shore Sexual Health Center and Sabita Pillai-Friedman from Widening University. I've been thinking a lot about this idea of accumulated loss and emergent pleasure, this sort of balancing act between all of the losses. And think about the losses that people may suffer from surgery, from chronic illness, from loss of a partner, from loss of their income, from loss of their professional status. You understand where I'm going with all this? As we age, it's just this constant barrage of feeling loss. And yet, I'm a sexuality educator. I believe in pleasure. There's this idea that I want to get across to people, that there's an emergence of pleasure that can be had for older adults. When we look at the physiology of arousal and orgasm, we know that there are two types of arousal: cognitive, meaning, erotic through trigger that sends signals to generate blood cells to fill with blood, or direct physical stimulation that triggers blood flow right to the genitals. For either route to be effective, the mind must be willing to accept and express the sensations for a sexual experience to continue. So if you proceed, it's a decision, and yet arousal can occur without willingness, right? So how does arousal proceed to orgasm? Arousal, stimulation, orgasm, just a quick trip through this. Thinking about willingness and your present state of mind, noticing and accepting stimulation, engorgement can occur. Even when your brain doesn't register it, the nerves of the pelvic floor that attach to the pelvic organs, even with spinal cord injuries, which we found through Whipple, Karamasic, and certainly Mitch Tepper's work, or by stimulation of other parts of the body, or by thinking. Think about Gina Ogden's work. Pleasure and ecstasy may be enjoyed without orgasm and are integral to many older adults' satisfying sexual experiences. So when someone comes to your office and says, I'm not able to achieve orgasm, does that mean sex is over for me? You can say, absolutely not. We have other ways that we can think about pleasure. And the role of overall health in sexual health as we age is probably one of the least understood areas, right? That this idea of willingness, good blood flow, healthy nerve function, strong and flexible pelvic floor function, and hormonal imbalance or balance are key to either sexual health or sexual dysfunction. And so if we think about good blood flow to the small blood vessels of the genitalia, for instance, an erection, both those with penises and those with clitorises can get an erection if there is adequate blood flow. Healthy nerve function means that we want to make sure we have undamaged nerves. And the need for strong and flexible pelvic floor muscles means that it can allow for comfortable penetration when desired. And the need for stamina to engage in sexual behaviors means that what I often tell older adults who come to my workshops is, don't wait till after dinner to have sex. Schedule sex earlier in the day. Yet willingness can be related to physical health in terms of chronic or acute bodily pain unrelated to your sexual activity, or pain as a result of sexual activity from physical injury or excess friction or dryness or lack of adequate warm-up or pelvic floor dysfunction or scar tissue. I know one of the lube companies that is marketing to older adults talks about their lube for sex, sport, and style. So thinking about these, the key points are that few people appreciate that overall health is important to sexual health as we age, not just for younger adults. And function can change desire, right? What are some of the ways in which function can change desire? Well, we look at initiation, we look at reluctance. Often, an older heterosexual couple will find that the person with the penis is less likely to initiate sex if there have been some performance issues of inability to have an erection, even though much of mass media might have you think that it's the older woman who is retreating from sex and having reluctance or avoidance. So thinking about how function can change desire, we can talk about that with our older clients and help them with some really, I think, very useful tools and tips. Because the major benefits of sexual expression include an awareness of the pleasures of touch. For many older adults who have, for one reason or another, not been able to have a sexual touch, the touch they receive from medical professionals is often I think of as more of a medicalized touch and not a pleasurable touch. That it can be a chance for a physical release and relaxation. Decreased anxiety about the body, even though body image is still such an issue for older adults, just like it is for younger adults. Once an older adult is having sex again, they often report decreased anxiety about their body. Increased body wisdom. One of the greatest sexuality educators, Peggy Brick, who passed away just a few years ago, wrote a wonderful curriculum, the first curriculum for older adult sexuality, that was entitled Older, Wiser, Sexually Smarter. And finally, really importance of the overall improvements in mental health and quality of life. Hey, I've got a couple of cases here from real cases that I wanted to just talk about with you for a moment. I want to check my time. Oh, we're doing fine. And, if we were in a small group, I'd want you to talk to me about them. But I want you to just get a sense of what's going on here in my world. A heterosexual married couple, ages 75 and 78, come to see you for sex therapy, and they tell you they're having trouble with sex. She says penetration is painful. He says he can't get an erection. So what are the challenges? But also, what are the possibilities? And as a clinician, what can you offer this couple? And if anyone would feel comfortable taking a risk and putting something in the chat, I'd love to hear what you have to say about it, because there are some great possibilities here, and I've given you some hints already. Here's another one. A gay man in his 60s comes to see you for sex therapy. He explains that he's been HIV positive for over 45 years. He's been single since his lover of 35 years died 5 years ago. And he wants to start a new relationship, but he's really concerned about his age and also his HIV status. So again, what are the challenges, but also what are the possibilities for this guy? Because there are possibilities out there. And it's not a foregone conclusion that, as one woman who came to me in one of my workshops said, I hit menopause at age 50 and my primary care physician said, that's it for me for sex. It's not it. I just want to remind you. So this is a really interesting case. And HIV, by the way, gay men in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who lived through the HIV pandemic of the 1980s and early 1990s are sensing something about this current pandemic that maybe other people aren't noticing. There's some resonance and there's some differences. But a man who has been living with his status as being HIV positive for this long, for over 3 decades, has had a lot of time to think about what it means to have a chronic illness. And he developed his HIV status before the antiretrovirals were developed in 1996. So thinking about all of the biopsychosocial issues for his case, as well as for this couple's case, would be very helpful to think about. So some more questions to consider. I mean, if you're a clinician or administrator, how do you acknowledge these issues and how do you convey how complex they are? How do you discuss sexual pleasure and how do you give them resources? I'd be happy to offer those to you. And if we don't have enough time today to answer all of your questions, I will give you my email. I'd be delighted to uh, uh, find out from you later on after this talk. Well, there's my penis puppet and my vulva puppet. You may have seen them behind me. That's Mulva, the vulva on the left, and that's Richard Johnson, but you can call him Willie on the right. And I use humor. I think about how people are feeling, and sometimes they're scared or embarrassed. They may be humiliated. They may be ashamed to talk about these issues. But I think about them as human beings first. And I try not to get caught up in ageist thinking. Although, I'm older myself, I still have some of my own implicit biases from the air and the water and the soil around here. But I like to use humor because I think it breaks some of the fears down. And when someone comes to me and talks about a penis not attaining erection, I talk about outer course. And when I hear someone talking about an irritated vaginal canal, I talk about lube. And I want people to remember that these are the beginnings of new pathways for older adults to feel good in their sexual bodies. I've got some clinical recommendations, and I want you to remember, just most importantly, that we're talking about human rights here. We're talking about the fact that sexuality goes from birth to death. That old people are not cute. Please don't ever ask someone their age and then say, but you don't look that old, or you look so cute for your age. Older adults really, really bristle and can't abide by those kind of comments. As I said, people are sexual throughout their lifespan. And age doesn't necessarily lead to sexual decline. There's no normal. Doors may be closing and other doors may be opening. And older adults may have a reticence talking about sex, just like younger adults. Sex can occur even in cognitive decline. And this idea of this dialectical kind of relationship between loss and pleasure. And that loss of cognitive awareness rarely leads to inappropriate sexual behavior, but it can still occur. And I used to have a sign on my door when I worked in a psych hospital that said, eschew obfuscations. But what I really meant was don't assume anything. Don't assume that your client is exclusively hetero or homosexual or monogamous or even able to articulate what their sexuality is. We know people who look at Lisa Diamond's work about sexual fluidity. We know people who have come out at a later age. We know people who have waited till their partner was deceased so they could begin their world of a kinky life. I mean, there's so many different possibilities for people. So please make no assumptions. And as a sexuality educator, we're really interested in KSAA, being knowledgeable, like coming to a workshop like this. Thank you so much for being here. Being skillful, practicing, really practice this idea that you can relate to older adults just like you do to your younger clients, and that their sexual lives are just as complex and important as human beings as any other age group. But the most important thing, right, is that you be askable and approachable. I know far too many people who have said to me, I went to see this one therapist for 20 years and they never asked me about sex. How can that be? So if you're a sex therapist, that's not going to be you. But if you're a clinician who is interested in older adults, please be askable and approachable about their sexual life. And don't feel like you got to know all this stuff that I've just given you off the top of your head, right? Know where to look up the information, but most importantly, be askable and approachable. And as I wrap up, I just want to make sure that you're ready to address your elder clients and patients and students' sexual questions, that you're ready to be receptive and open to discussing these issues. And really, most importantly, is are you ready to sit in the discomfort of talking about sex with elders? You know, there are so many ways that people need to talk about their sexuality, and you could be that person to talk with them. So remember, older adults have the right to challenge social norms. Older adults have the right to lead full and complex sexual lives. If you're talking with your patients, remind them that they can accept their body for wherever they are. I like to remind people that, they may feel uncomfortable that there's hair loss, there's hair gain, there's sagging, there's wrinkles, there's all sorts of different spots that show up on your body as you age. But if you're getting into bed with someone or having sex with someone on the couch or wherever you feel comfortable, they're going to be just as nervous about their naked body as yours. And when you're there about a quarter of an inch from their body as they are from yours, and you're lying down, they're not going to see all of the effects of gravity. They're just going to be looking into your eyes. So accepting your body for where you are and where your potential partners are could be a wonderful gift that you could give your older patients, and to invite them to bring in the possibility of emergent pleasure and joy. That they need to communicate. They need to be prepared. You know, you can't be as spontaneous as you were when you were younger. Older adults need to make sure they've got their sex toy by the bed, that it's charged up, that they've got their lube and tissues, medication, that they've got their Bluetooth speaker and their phone is charged up to the right station. All of that, you can understand, could be important for preparing for sex and to try something new. For Dr. Pillai-Friedman, she said for some of her older clients, they were getting a little bit bored with intercourse after intercourse was not a potential for them. So she offered them some ideas about different types of toys, and she talked about blindfolds and restraints, and people tried all sorts of new things. So invite them to try something new. Finally, remember humor, patience, and loving kindness. My colleague, Joan Price, who's an amazing sexuality educator, if you haven't read any of her books, please look her up, says that there's no expiration date on sex. And given all that we're going through right now, right? I mean, with COVID and what's going on in Haiti and what's going on, in Afghanistan, there's so much bad stuff going on in the world. And what we've been through in this past 40 minutes or so, think about one intervention you might take to promote sexual wellness with older adults in your practice. And if you'd be so kind as to put it in the chat, I know we'd all really welcome your ideas. Even a small step can be an amazing one. So that's it. That's all I've got to say to you. Oh, you'll never be able to read this. Sorry about that. Lots of references. If you're interested in any of the studies that I've put forward today or any of the books I've talked about, please let me know and I'll be happy to send you the references. Here's some Spanish language resources. You can't click these links, but I can send these to you. And just one last thought. The older adults in your practice may have never spoken to anyone about sex before. And you may never have spoken to an older adult about sex before. But your job is to help create joy in your clients' remaining years in whatever ways make the most sense to them. A shameless plug for my new book that Lisa was nice enough to mention. I just got a Nautilus Award. I'm really excited about it. If you're interested in getting the book, please go to your independent bookstore. Don't go to Walmart. Don't go to Amazon. Support your independent bookstores. They really need you now more than ever. And ask for the Stonewall Generation. And if you're interested in getting in touch with me, I mean this. I would love to hear from you. There's my email. That's my website for our podcast. It's called Our Better Half, and there's my website. And just big thanks to Dr. Alex Katahakis and to Melissa Ibarra for inviting me here today, and for all of you, thank you so much. Melissa, any questions?
So the first one from Brian, an old question, but a common one. What to do when two partners develop different levels of sexual interest over time? Example, one wants, initiates, prefers it more, maybe much more, exclamation point,
Yeah.
often than the other. How do we guide clients on either side of that situation?
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Brian Wilson. And maybe are you the Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys? I hope so. This would make me very happy. Um, so Brian, so our term for this is discrepant desire. And often we have to really go underneath and look at what are some of the possibilities that one partner is looking to initiate more often, much more often than the other, and find out if it's really desire and interest, or maybe it's a fear of something going wrong, or it might be some embarrassment about, perhaps there's incontinence, perhaps there's flatulence. I've heard so many of these kinds of stories, and they become very shame-based. And so what I would do is I would really want you to talk to both of the individuals and ask them what it was like before this occurred, and maybe what their idea is of really good sex, right? To use Barry McCarthy's term, what would be really good sex? Maybe not ideal sex, but what's really good sex? And how might the two of them work with you to find out how to uncover it? And I would also recommend, I'm looking back here, I have so many good books here. I wish I were with you today, I would bring them. But I would love to suggest that for older adults, look at some of Joan Price's books. They're fantastic. And she speaks to sexuality educators and sex therapists all over the world. And she gets great suggestions from all of them about just these kind of questions. So yeah, I would really recommend doing more research. And if that doesn't help, feel free to write me. I'm going to put my email in here.
So a second question here, how do you address expressions by clients and others that older adults are not sexually appealing?
Yeah, what a great question. So what are we talking about? Are we talking about media images? Because if we're talking about media images of appeal, sexual appeal equals young. Sexual appeal equals skinny. Sexual appeals equals flat abs or six-pack abs. Sexual appeal, if we're looking at mass media images, I'm not talking about how we want people to be thinking about it. I'm just suggesting how we get kind of bombarded with these images. Ageism permeates our ideas of what sexual appeal is. And so what I would suggest is that we really begin to unpack what's the ageist notion of appeal and what's our innate notion. And we can do that. Emily Nagoski did a really nice job for us in her first book, Come As You Are. Actually, I don't know if it's her first book, but her second edition of her latest book. She has another book out about stress response. But in Come As You Are, one of the things that Emily does really well is talks about the brakes and the accelerators. She looks at the Bancroft and the Kinsey Institute balance of what makes it more exciting to have sex and what makes it less exciting. Like, I really don't want to go there. And she has really a nice set of questions for partners to answer with each other, to develop their own understanding of what gets them excited and what really turns them off. And when you know what's a turn on and what's a turn off, it can be really helpful to really unpack what's ageism and what's me, right? Who am I? I hope that answered your question.
So the last one that I could quickly find, how does alcoholism affect men's interest in sex?
Anytime we are impairing our ability to have a consciousness of good blood flow, good cognition, and our mental health in balance, we can really see a decline in sexual pleasure. So alcohol use of a moderate degree may not affect us at all, but alcohol ingested in higher proportions may not only affect our abilities, our nerve function and blood flow, but it can also affect our memory. And I think one of the things about sexuality for older adults is that we have to talk to older adults about this idea that we may not have sex as often as we did when we were in our 20s and 30s, when we were just ready to rip off our clothes and, have sex on the kitchen table or a counter. Now as we get older, our hips are a little bit hurting and our knees hurt a little bit, and it's not as easy to do our pelvic thrusts as we used to. But when we get older, it's that long feeling after we have sex of that sense of relief and release and a memory of that real joy. And so I would suggest that we want to make sure that we talk with older adults about impairments as actually being an impediment to having that function as well as that memory. I hope that makes sense. I know this was a quick and wild ride through sexuality and aging. I've got lots of other stuff I'd love to talk with you about. And if you're interested in bringing me to your agency or your facility, please let me know. I'd be delighted to speak with you again. Thanks for having me, Melissa. Nice to sort of see you all.